is Catherine Clune-Taylor, and I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Alberta, as well as a research assistant with the Situating Science Cluster Grant, sponsors of the October long lecture series here at the U of A in honor of Alfred Russel Wallace, titled More Than Natural Selection. In commemoration of the 100-year anniversary of Wallace's death, the University of Alberta node of the Cluster Grant is bringing you this series of podcasts featuring a short discussion between myself and that week's speaker that goes beyond the lecture and, in addition to other things, finds out how each of these respected scholars from a variety of different disciplines came to take up the work of Alfred Russel Wallace.
Okay, so we're here today with Dr. Christine Ferguson. She's a senior lecturer in English literature at the University of Glasgow and a former prof here at the University of Alberta, so it's great to have you back for this little homecoming. And she's going to be, this is another one of these interviews that we're doing ahead of the lecture, so it won't be necessarily as specific to the lecture as some of the others. But it is really, really interesting. One of the things that we've been talking about over the course of this kind of podcast series is that one of the great things about this lecture series has been how it's been able to kind of give people a sense of the full Wallace, right? We've always kind of hear about Wallace as this footnote to the history of evolution. Sometimes, hopefully, he's a little less than a footnote, but often, for a long time, he was just kind of a footnote. And people didn't really have a sense of what a polymath he was, and what a wide range of interests he had. He was really interested in politics, and astrobiology is one thing that we've talked about in the course of this lecture. It's been really fascinating. And everyone, though, has touched upon his spiritualism, although not in any depth. And that's something that you're going to be talking about today. And so I'm thrilled to be able to hear from you because everyone in this series has, well, not gone into much depth about his spiritualism, has noted that it is central to kind of his overall worldview.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, or kind of give us a little bit of a brief kind of overview or say something about Wallace's connection to spiritualism, because I think it's something that people, even those who are interested in Wallace, are only kind of now coming to grips with, or kind of being able to try to place into context of the rest of his work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Wallace officially came out, as it were, as a spiritualist in 1865, and I think for a long time the opinion that this was a reaction to personal loss. It was something aside from his other pursuits, a sort of minor blip in an otherwise fully rationalist career. But we have a different picture now. We know that he was interested in movements like phrenology, all of which sort of what we would now call pseudoscience movements that really fed into early spiritualism. From as early as the 1840s, he was really interested in Robert Owen, who was, of course, one of the earliest high-profile British converts. So spiritualism, I think now we see that far from it being outside of the main Wallace, is absolutely central to his interests in social justice, in human evolution, in approaches to ethnography and understanding human variation. So it's absolutely in the mainstream of his thought, and he produced some of the most interesting and maddening and baffling defences of spiritualism in the public sphere in the 1870s. So he's a central figure both for the movement and also just for thinking about what spiritualism meant in the wider world in the 19th century.
Well, and it's really interesting to hear or to see people from such a variety of disciplines who are interested in Wallace. That's something that's really come out in the course of this series. So I was wondering, how was it that you first came into contact with Wallace's work? I'm especially kind of interested as someone who knows him from biology, from that biological background, and didn't have a sense of his other interests. Is he someone that figured in, like, people who were kind of looking at spiritualism at that period? Did he figure in there for a long period of time, or we're just kind of coming to him?
Yeah, I think that he's been, his contribution to spiritualism has been recognised for a long time, although I think he's more known as a public, high-profile convert, rather. I don't think the actual nature of his spiritualist thought has, and its contradictions, has been interrogated in as much detail as it could be, because it is really interesting. So certainly I came to him through spiritualism, but I would say that Wallace has been haunting me my whole career. Every project I've done in 19th century, I describe my work as being about sort of the intersection between Victorian literature, science, and what we would think of as discarded knowledge.
Okay.
Right? So
that's really interesting.
when I was working on my first book, which was about debates about how language came about, language origins, some very strange 19th century ideas about there. Wallace had something to contribute to that debate. He's there talking about certainly his travel writing, something I came across in another context, and then of course when I came to write this book on spiritualism, there he was again. So he's so polymathic. I think it'd be really hard to find a field in which he's not contributing in some way, whether it be politics or science, or even literature. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done on that side of him too, but he's everywhere.
He really does seem to be, and it's so funny how many people kind of end up saying that they feel like, even if they weren't working specifically on Wallace or focused on Wallace, they feel like he's kind of been in the background for a long time, following them or something like that.
Or
like,
stalked by Wallace.
Everyone's like, I read something about Wallace at some point and it stayed with me. I feel like he's always kind of been there in the background. And it's interesting because for a lot of people for whom he has been in the background for a long time, he seems to be coming to the foreground. There does seem to be this real kind of, I don't want to call it a resurgence, but I think a turn to, like a more serious turn towards Wallace in the last, say, decade or two. And why do you think that might be?
Well, obviously a big part of it has to do with the Darwin celebrations in 2009, so people were looking for that context. But of course it's not just that. I mean, for me, Wallace's contribution to natural selection is undisputed, but his late life work, when he's thinking about socialism, when he's thinking about feminism in particular, when he's coming out, particularly as a vocal opponent of eugenics, for example, those debates and those precedents become really important now when, as you know, here at University of Alberta, we're very interested in eugenics history and sort of reclaiming those contemporary voices who in some ways really anticipate modern attacks on biodeterminism and so forth. So that work is really exciting, it's really relevant, and there's so much more to do with it.
Yeah, it really seems like a lot of, it's quite interesting, it seems like a lot of the discussions, or at least the questions he was posing then, are very current, right? Questions or concerns about the environment and scientific progress, right? Or political concerns, right? About capitalism. And so or even actually, one thing that I find is very interesting is that I think a lot of his critiques of Darwin are ones that are now being taken up very seriously. So it is really kind of interesting how Wallace is becoming this very kind of contemporary figure. All of a sudden, right?
100 years later.
100 years later, he seems now to be a man of this time.
Exactly.
It's really, really fascinating. And so I was wondering maybe if you could say, in some ways a little bit more, I'm really interested perhaps in his worldview, how it was that his interactions and his travels with other cultures influenced this spiritualism. Could you say a little bit about that? Or?
Yeah, I think that relationship's been misunderstood. I think there's an assumption that his extensive travels, I mean, very few other scientists in the 1860s had anywhere near the ethnographic experience of Wallace. The assumption is that those two parts of his career work in tandem somehow, and sort of he's receptive to this new faith because he's receptive to different peoples and he's had cross-cultural contact. My paper today is arguing that that's actually not the case. In his early spiritualist writings, at least this changes. He's very nervous about the spectre of what he called primitive spiritualism. Although extremely respectful of the people he encountered and of their society and their morality, he has a real concern that what he's doing, the way that he's conceptualizing of contact with the other world, will be relegated to that same category, which he saw as being unsystematized, as being materialistic and ritualistic. That changed in his career, but he was a bit squeamish about that for a number of reasons that I think are really interesting. So for a while, his spiritualism is very much a Western spiritualism, a scientific spiritualism. Even though in his personal life, the mediums he's contacting are, they're not high-profile white males at all, but in his writing, that's the case he wants to make.
It is so fascinating to think about Wallace sitting down with mediums.
Yes.
To be a fly on that wall would have been fascinating.
He had a reputation for being one of the most enthusiastic but also gullible spiritualist believers, even among other believers, and they were concerned that in some sense he was sullying the cause by being too willing to champion mediums who had been caught or discredited or in some case even confessed. So in that part of his life he's an enthusiast, and he's really willing to accept anything. It's hard to find a case of Wallace, strenuously rejecting a particular medium who's been caught.
Yeah, and in some ways I think that's maybe, and I'm guessing here, but in some ways I wonder if that's what made it so difficult for such a long time to try to square his spiritualism with his other work, because we tend to see Wallace as this excellent writer, this very systematic thinker, right? Very, very cautious and patient in a lot of ways. And so his kind of enthusiasm for spiritualism, we just kind of can't square those. And so I think it makes sense to me that might be one of the reasons why for a long time it was kind of bracketed off as the other thing that he did. Let's not talk about it too much.
Although he would, he always insisted that he pursued his spiritualist pursuits with as much rigor as anything else, and that he went to, and he was, especially in the early 70s and late 60s, he was going to seances with an incredible frequency. So for him this was repeated test conditions, all leading to the same conclusion. But of course his colleagues didn't see it that way.
Yeah, understandably so. Well, thanks so much for sitting down and talking to us today. This has helped me to kind of really get a sense over the course of this series, a sense of Wallace in his entirety, right? We see kind of such a really complex, fascinating man who was interested in so many things, and I think it is so fascinating to me in some ways that he was such a kind of publicly engaged intellectual, right? That anything that he was interested in, he would teach himself about so that he could engage in kind of a public venue about it. But it is just so fascinating to see someone who was so kind of genuinely curious and willing to jump into things even if they weren't, even if other people maybe were a little bit more cautious about them. He just kind of jumped in full hog and...
Yeah, I mean, maybe ultimately that's a model for how we should pursue our own intellectual projects. Maybe not dabbling in the pseudosciences, but the openness, the willingness to pose the question, and also that really principled commitment to interdisciplinarity, to working across different fields, and a sense that knowledge should and must lead to social justice. I mean, that's what I respect most about Wallace. I don't often or always agree with his stances, but that idea is so important.
Yeah, it seems to me that as well, or that seems to be true to me as well, and it seems to be something that I think that in the academy today we're really struggling with, or kind of wrestling with. I mean, I think you see a lot of universities and different programs that are moving towards more interdisciplinarity. Like that seems to be kind of a catchphrase, but it's not clear always, I think, what the goal is or what the hope is out of that.
Is it a true intellectual ideal, or is it cost-cutting measure?
Yeah, right.
And is it interdisciplinary light or deep? And Wallace's was deep. He learned the new disciplines. He learned the new areas. He really wanted to. It was much more than a sort of artificial combination of different areas for him, and that absolutely is how we need to move forward with interdisciplinarity. Yeah,
so maybe that's a nice place to kind of end the podcast series, is Wallace as a model of kind of intellectual courage and a commitment to social justice. That sounds great. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks very much, Catherine.
That's that's it for this week's podcast. Thanks so much to both our guests and to you for joining us. For more information on the Situating Science Cluster Grant or on the Wallace Lecture Series speakers and their talks, please visit us online at www.situsci, that's SITUSCI.ca.